Operation Cobra was the code name for an offensive launched by the 1st United States Army 7 weeks after the D-Day landings. During the Normandy campaign of World War II, American Lieutenant General Omar Bradley's intention was to take advantage of the German preoccupation with British and Canadian activity around the town of Caen, in Operation Goodwood, and immediately punch through the German defences that were penning in his troops while the Germans were distracted and unbalanced. Once a corridor had been created, the First Army would then be able to advance into Brittany, rolling up the German flanks and releasing itself of the constraints imposed by operating in the Norman Bocage countryside. After a slow start, the offensive gathered momentum, and German resistance collapsed as scattered remnants of broken units fought to escape to the Seine. Lacking the resources to cope with the situation, the German response was ineffectual, and the entire Normandy front soon collapsed. Operation Cobra, together with concurrent offensives by the 2nd British and 1st Canadian Armies, was decisive in securing an Allied victory in the Normandy campaign. Having been delayed several times by poor weather, Operation Cobra commenced on the 25th of July with a concentrated aerial bombardment from thousands of Allied aircraft. Supporting offensives had drawn the bulk of German armoured reserves toward the British and Canadian sector, and coupled with the general lack of men and materiel available to the Germans, it was impossible for them to form successive lines of defense. Units of 7th Corps led the initial two-division assault, while other 1st Army Corps mounted supporting attacks designed to pin German units in place. Progress was slow on the first day, but opposition started to crumble once the defensive crust had been broken. By the 27th of July, most organized resistance had been overcome, and 7th and 8th Corps were advancing rapidly, isolating the Cotentin Peninsula. By the 31st of July, 19th Corps had destroyed the last forces opposing the First Army, and Bradley's troops were finally freed from the Bocage. Reinforcements were moved west by Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge and employed in various counterattacks, the largest of which was launched on the 7th of August between Mortain and Avranches. Although this led to the bloodiest phase of the battle, it was mounted by already exhausted and under-strength units, and had little effect other than to further deplete von Kluge's forces. On the 8th of August, troops of the newly activated 3rd United States Army captured the city of Le Mans, formerly the German 7th Army's headquarters. Operation Cobra transformed the high-intensity infantry combat of Normandy into rapid maneuver warfare, and led to the creation of the Falaise Pocket and the loss of the German position in northwestern France. Background: following the successful Allied invasion of Normandy on 6 June 1944, progress inland was slow. To facilitate the Allied build-up in France and to secure room for further expansion, the deep-water port of Cherbourg on the western flank of the American sector and the historic town of Caen in the British and Canadian sector to the east were early objectives. The original plan for the Normandy campaign envisioned strong offensive efforts in both sectors, in which the Second Army would secure Caen and the area south of it, and the First U.S. Army would wheel round to the Loire. General Sir Bernard Montgomery, commanding all Allied ground forces in Normandy, intended Caen to be taken on D-Day, while Cherbourg was expected to fall 15 days later. The Second Army was to seize Caen and then form a front to the southeast, extending to Caumont-la-Reventé, to acquire airfields and protect the left flank of the First U.S. Army as it moved on Cherbourg. Possession of Caen and its surroundings, desirable for open terrain that would permit maneuver warfare, would also give the Second Army a suitable staging area for a push south to capture Falaise, which could be used as the pivot for a swing right to advance on Argentan and then the Touques River. Caen's capture has been described by historian L. F. Ellis as the most important D-Day objective assigned to Lieutenant General Crocker's British First Corps. Ellis and Chester Wilmot called the Allied plan ambitious, since the Caen sector contained the strongest defences in Normandy. The initial attempt by 1st Corps to reach the city on D-Day was blocked by elements of the 21st Panzer Division, and with the Germans committing most of the reinforcements sent to meet the invasion to the defense of Caen, the Anglo-Canadian front rapidly congealed short of Second Army's objectives. Operation Perch in the week following D-Day and Operation Epsom brought some territorial gains and depleted its defenders, but Caen remained in German hands until Operation Charnwood, when the Second Army managed to take the northern part of the city up to the River Orne in a frontal assault. The successive Anglo-Canadian offensives around Caen kept the best of the German forces in Normandy, including most of the available armour, to the eastern end of the Allied lodgment, but even so 1st U.S. Army made slow progress against dogged German resistance. In part, operations were slow due to the constraints of the bocage landscape of densely packed, banked hedgerows, sunken lanes, and small woods, for which U.S. units had not trained. With no port facilities in Allied hands, all reinforcement and supply had to take place over the beaches via the two Mulberry harbours and was at the mercy of the weather. On the 19th of June, a severe storm descended on the English Channel, lasting for 3 days, and causing significant delays to the Allied build-up and the cancellation of some planned operations. The 1st U.S. Army advance in the western sector was eventually halted by Bradley before the town of St. Lo, to concentrate on the seizure of Cherbourg. The defense of Cherbourg consisted largely of 4 battle groups formed from the remnants of units that had retreated up the Cotentin Peninsula, but the port defenses had been designed principally to meet an attack from the sea. Organized German resistance ended only on the 27th of June, when the 9th U.S. Infantry Division managed to reduce the defenses of Cap de la Hague, northwest of the city. Within 4 days, 7th Corps resumed the offensive toward St. Lo, alongside 19th Corps and 8th Corps, causing the Germans to move additional armor into the U.S. sector. Planning. The originator of the idea for Operation Cobra remains disputed. According to Montgomery's official biographer, the foundation of Operation Cobra was laid on the 13th of June. Planning was immensely aided by detailed ultra-intelligence which supplied up-to-date decodes of communications between German high command and Hitler's generals. Montgomery's plan at that time called for Bradley's First Army to take St. Lo and Coutances and then make 2 southward thrusts, one from Caumont toward Vire and Mortagne, and the other from St. Lo toward Villedieu and Avranches. Although pressure was to be kept up along the Cotentin Peninsula towards La Haye-du-Puy and Valognes, the capture of Cherbourg was not an immediate priority. However, with Cherbourg's seizure by Collins' 7th Corps on the 27th of June, Montgomery's initial timetable was soon outdated and the thrust from Caumont was never adopted. Following the conclusion of Operation Charnwood and the cancellation of First Army's offensive towards St. Lo, Montgomery met with Bradley and Dempsey on the 10th of July to discuss 21st Army Group's next move. During the meeting, Bradley admitted that progress on the western flank was very slow. However, he had been working on plans for a breakout attempt, codenamed Operation Cobra, to be launched by the First Army on the 18th of July. He presented his ideas to Montgomery, who approved, and the directive that emerged from the meeting made it clear that the overall strategy over the coming days would be to draw enemy attention away from the First Army to the British and Canadian sector. Dempsey was instructed to go on hitting, drawing the German strength, especially the armor, onto yourself, so as to ease the way for Bradley. To accomplish this, Operation Goodwood was planned, and Eisenhower ensured that both operations would have the support of the Allied air forces with their strategic bombers. On the 12th of July, Bradley briefed his subordinate commanders on the Cobra plan, which consisted of 3 phases. The main effort would be under the control of Collins' 7th Corps. In the first phase, the breakthrough attack would be conducted by Major General Eddy's 9th and Major General Hobbs' 30th Infantry Divisions, which would punch a hole in the German tactical zone and then hold the flanks of the penetration, while Major General Hübner's 1st Infantry and Major General Brooks' 2nd Armored Divisions pushed into the depth of the position until resistance collapsed. The 1st Infantry Division was to take Marigny, with this objective exploited by a stream of General Watson's 3rd Armored Division armor that would move south toward Coutances. The 2nd Armored Division, part of Collins' exploitation force, of the 2nd Armored Division in the east of the 7th Corps sector, and the 1st Infantry Division, reinforced by Combat Command B of the 3rd Armored Division in the west, would pass through the 30th Infantry Division sector and guard the overall American left flank. If 7 Corps efforts were successful, the Western German position would become untenable, permitting a relatively easy advance to the southwest end of the Bocage to cut off and seize the Brittany Peninsula. First Army's intelligence estimated that no German counterattack would occur in the first few days after Cobra's launch, and that if attacks materialized after that date, they would consist of no more than battalion-sized operations. Cobra was to be a concentrated attack on a 7,000 yards front, unlike previous American broad front offensives, and would have heavy air support. Fighter bombers would concentrate on hitting forward German defenses in a 250 yards belt immediately south of the St. Lo Road, while General Sporatz's heavy bombers would bomb to a depth of 2,500 yards behind the German main line of resistance. It was anticipated that the physical destruction and shock value of a short, intense preliminary bombardment would greatly weaken the German defense. So in addition to divisional artillery, Army and Corps-level units would provide support, including 9 heavy, 5 medium, and 7 light artillery battalions. Over 1,000 tubes of divisional and corps artillery were committed to the offensive, and approximately 140,000 artillery rounds were allocated to the operation in 7th Corps alone, with another 27,000 for 8th Corps, in an attempt to overcome the mobility constraints of the Bocage that had made offensive operations so difficult and costly for both sides. Rhino modifications were made to some M4 Sherman and M5A1 Stuart tanks, and M10 tank destroyers, by fitting them with hedge-breaching tusks that were capable of forcing a path through the Norman hedgerows, while German tanks remained restricted to the roads. U.S. Army would now be able to maneuver more freely, although in practice these devices were not as effective as often believed. However, by the eve of Cobra, 60% of First Army's tanks were so equipped. To preserve operational security, Bradley forbade their use until Cobra was launched. In all, 1,269 M4 medium tanks, 694 M5A1 light tanks, and 288 M10 tank destroyers were available. Supporting operations on the 18th of July, the British 8th and 1st Corps, to the east of Caen, launched Operation Goodwood. The offensive began with the largest air bombardment in support of ground forces yet, with more than 1,000 aircraft dropping 6,000 short tons of high explosive and fragmentation bombs from low altitude. German positions to the east of Caen were shelled by 400 artillery pieces and many villages were reduced to rubble. But German artillery further to the south, on the Bergebis Ridge, was outside the range of the British artillery, and the defenders of Cagny and Emy-Eville were largely unscathed by the bombardment. This contributed to the losses suffered by Second Army, which sustained over 4,800 casualties, principally an armoured offensive. Between 250 and 400 British tanks were put out of action, although recent examination suggests that only 140 were completely destroyed with an additional 174 damaged. The operation remains the largest tank battle ever fought by the British Army, and resulted in the expansion of the Orne bridgehead and the final capture of Caen. Simultaneously, the 2nd Canadian Corps on Goodwood's western flank launched Operation Atlantic, intended to strengthen the Allied foothold along the banks of the Orne River and take Verrières Ridge to the south of Caen. Atlantic made initial gains but ran out of steam as casualties mounted, having cost the Canadians 1,349 men, and with the heavily defended ridge firmly in German hands, Atlantic was closed down on the 20th of July. However, at Montgomery's urging, strongly underlined in the Supreme Commander's communications to Montgomery, 2 Canadian Corps' commander, Lieutenant General Guy Simonds, launched his second offensive a few days later, codenamed Operation Spring. This had the limited but important aim of tying down German units that might otherwise be transferred to the American sector, although Simonds took the opportunity to make another bid for Verrières Ridge. Again, the fighting for Verrières Ridge proved extremely bloody for the Canadians, with the 25th of July marking the single costliest day for a Canadian battalion, the Black Watch of Canada, since the Jet Parade of 1942. A counterstroke by 2 German divisions pushed the Canadians back past their start lines, and Simonds had to commit reinforcements to stabilize the front. However, in conjunction with Goodwood, the Canadian operations caused the Germans to commit most of their armor and additional reinforcements to the British and Canadian sector. Operation Spring, despite its cost, had drawn the 9th SS Panzer Division away from the U.S. sector on the eve of Cobra's launch. Only 2 panzer divisions with 190 tanks now faced Bradley's First Army. 7 panzer divisions with 750 tanks were positioned in the Caen area, far away from where Operation Cobra would be launched, as were all the heavy Tiger tank battalions and all 3 Nebelwerfer brigades in Normandy. Logistics: each division consumed 750 short tons of supplies daily.